Hi, I'm Sharyn, Education and Youth Librarian with Wyndham City Libraries. Welcome back to Virtual Teen Read Along for Chapter 14 of Tomorrow When the War Began by John Marsden. In the last chapter we found out that conflict seems to be about reducing balances between the haves and have-nots. Fiona starts to like Homer and Ali seems confused about who she likes, Homer or Lee. Let's read Chapter 14.
Monday morning, a dark river of aircraft flowed overhead for an hour or more. Not hours, unfortunately. I'd never seen so many aircraft. They looked like big, fat transport planes, and they weren't being molested by anyone. Though a half hour later, 6 of our Air Force jets whistled past on the same route. We waved to them, optimistically. We'd been back to my place very early and brought up another load. More food, tools, clothing, toiletries, bedding, and a few odds and ends that we'd forgotten before, like barbecue tools, Tupperware, a clock, and, I'm embarrassed to say, hot water bottles. Robin had asked for a Bible. I knew he had one somewhere, and I found it eventually, dusted it off and added it to the collection. It was tricky because we couldn't take so much stuff that would be obvious to patrols that someone was on the loose. So we went on to the Gruber's, about a K away, and helped ourselves to a lot more food. I also picked up a collection of seeds and seedlings from Mr. Gruber's potting shed. I was starting to think like Homer and plan for the long term. The last thing we got were half a dozen chooks, our best layers, some pallets, fencing wire and star pickets. As dawn broke, we rattled up on the track, the chooks murmuring curiously to each other in the back. I let Homer drive this time, figuring he needed the practice. To amuse Fee, I closed my eyes, picked up the Bible, opened it at random, pointed to a spot, opened my eyes and read the verse, saying at the same time, "Through my psychic finger, I will find a sentence that applies to us." The one I picked was this: "I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them my enemies." "Golly," said Fee, "I thought the Bible was meant to be full of love and forgiveness and all that stuff." I kept reading. "Deliver me, O Lord, from evil men. Preserve me from violent men who plan evil things in their heart and stir up wars continually." The others were really impressed. So was I, but I wasn't going to let on to them. "See, I told you," I said. "I do have a psychic finger." "Try another one," Homer said. But I wasn't going to throw my reputation away that easily. "No, you've heard the words of wisdom," I said. "That's all for today." Fee grabbed the Bible and tried the same ritual. The first time she got a blank section of page at the end of the chapters. The second time she read, "Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego in the province of Babylon." "It's no good," I said. "You have to have the psychic finger." "Maybe the one you read would make Robin feel better about gunning soldiers down," Homer said to me. I marked the page. "I'll show her when they get back." No one mentioned the possibility that they might not get back. That's why people always are, I think. They figure if they say something bad, they might magically make it happen. I don't think words are that powerful. We reached the top, hid the landy, and took the chooks and whatever else we could carry into hell. We'd have to wait until dark to get the other stuff. It was too dangerous being up on Taylor's Stitch with daylight coming on and so many aircraft around. And it was shaping up to be a scorcher. Even down in hell, where it was normally cool, the air was getting furnace hot. But to my surprise, we found Lee leaning against a tree at the opposite end of the clearing to where we'd left him. "Hooly dooly," I said. "You've risen from the dead." "I should have chosen a cooler morning," he said, grinning, "but I got sick of sitting there. I thought it was time for some exercise, now that I've recovered from the truck ride." He was grinning, very pleased with himself, but sweating. I rinsed a towel in the creek and wiped his face. "Are you sure you should be doing this?" I asked. He shrugged. It felt right. I remembered how quite often, when our animals got sick or injured, they'd get themselves into a hole somewhere. Under the shearing shed was a popular place for the dogs, and they'd stay there for days and days, until they either died or came out fresh and cured and wagging their tails. Maybe Lee was the same. He'd kept pretty still since he'd been shot, lying among the rocks, thinking his quiet thoughts. He wasn't yet wagging his tail, but the energy was returning to his face. "The day you can sprint from one end of this clearing to the other," I said, "we'll chop off a chook's head and have a chicken dinner." "Robin can cut the stitches out when she gets back from Wirrawee," he said. "They've been in long enough." I helped him to a shady place near the creek where we could sit together in a damp, dark basin of rock, probably the coolest spot in hell that day. "Ali," he said. He cleared his throat nervously. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you. That day back at your place, in the haystack, when you came over to where I was lying and you laid down and we—" All right, I interrupted. "I know what we did." "I thought you might have forgotten." Do you think I do that kind of stuff so often I can't remember? It wasn't exactly an everyday event for me, you know. Well, you haven't looked at me since then. You've hardly even spoken to me. I was pretty out of it for a few days. I just slept and slept. Yes, but since then? Since then, I sighed. Since then I've been confused. I don't know what I think. Will you ever know what you think? If I could answer that, I'd probably know everything. Have I said something to upset you or done something? No, it's just me. I don't know what I'm doing half the time. So I do things and I don't always mean what I think I mean. Do you know what I mean? I asked, hopefully, because I sure wasn't myself. So you're saying it didn't mean anything? I don't know. It meant something at the time, and it means something now, but I don't know. If it means what you seem to want it to mean, why don't we just say I was being a slut and leave it at that? He looked really hurt and I was sorry. I'd said that. I didn't even mean it. It's a bit difficult sitting down here, he said. If you want to get rid of me, you're the one who'll have to go. Oh, Lee, I don't want to get rid of you. I don't want to get rid of anyone. You'll have to get on living in this place the way we are for God knows how long. Yes, he said, this place, hell. It seems like hell sometimes. Now, for instance. I don't know why I was talking the way I was. It was all happening too unexpectedly. It was a conversation I wasn't ready for. I guess I like to be in control of things, and Lee had forced this on me at a time and a place that he'd chosen. I wish Corrie were there so I could go and talk to her about it. Lee was so intense, he scared me, but at the same time I felt something strong when he was around. I just didn't know what it was. I was always very conscious when I was near him. My skin felt hotter. I'd be watching him out of the corner of my eye, directing my comments at him, noticing his reactions, listening more for his words than for anyone else's. If he expressed an opinion, I'd think about it more carefully, give it more weight than I would, say, Kevin's or Chris's. I used to think about him a lot in my sleeping bag at nights. Because I'd been thinking about him as I drifted into sleep, I tended to dream about him. It got so that, this sounds stupid, but it's true, I associated him with my sleeping bag. When I looked at one, I'd think of the other. That doesn't necessarily mean I wanted him in my sleeping bag, but they had started to go together in my mind. I nearly smiled as I sat there thinking about that and wondering how he'd look if he could suddenly read my thoughts. Do you still think about Steve a lot? He asked. No, not Steve. I think about him in the same way I think about a lot of people, wondering if they're all right and hoping they are, but I don't think about him in the way you mean. Well, if I haven't offended you and you're not with Steve anymore, then where does that leave me? He asked, getting exasperated. Do you just dislike me as a person? No, I said, horrified at that idea, but getting a bit annoyed too, at the way he was trying to bully me into a relationship. Guys do that all the time. They want definite answers, as long as they're the right answers. And they think if they keep it you long enough, they'll get them. Look, I said, sorry, I can't give you a list of my feelings about you in point form and alphabetical order, but I just can't. I'm all confused. That day in the haystack was no accident. It meant something. I'm still trying to figure out what. You say you don't dislike me, he said slowly, like he was trying to figure it out. He was looking away from me and he was very nervous, but he was obviously leading up to an important question. So does that mean you like me? Yes, Lee, I like you very much, but right now you're driving me crazy. It was funny how often I thought of us having this conversation, but now that we were having it, I didn't know if I was saying what I wanted to say. I've noticed you looking at Homer kind of special since we've been up here. Have you got a thing for him? It'd be my business if I did, because I don't think he's right for you. Oh, Lee, you're so annoying today. Maybe you shouldn't have tried walking on that leg. I honestly think it's weakened your brain. Let's blame it on that, or the weather, or something, because you don't own me. You don't have any right to decide who's right or wrong for me, and don't you forget it. I stormed off in a hot passion to the other side of the clearing, where Fee and Homer had been making a yard for the chooks. The chooks were in it, looking shocked, maybe because they'd heard me chucking my tantrum. More likely because they were wondering what the hell they were doing there. Oh, what the hell? I just made a joke. I watched the chooks for a while, then cut across the clearing again to where the creek wandered back into thick bush and lost itself in a dark tunnel of undergrowth. I've been thinking for a few days I might try to explore down there a bit. Impossible and impassable though it seemed. This might be the time to do it if I could work off some anger and get my mind onto something else. Besides, it looked cool in there. Took my boots and socks off, stuffed the socks in the boots and tied the boots around my neck. Then I bent over and tried to pretend I was a wombat, a water wombat. I'm the right shape for that, and it was the only way to get under all that vegetation. I was using the creek as a path, but there was a definite sensation of going along a tunnel. The greenery arched so low that it scraped my back. Even when I was almost kissing the water, it was cool. I doubt if the sun had penetrated the creepers for years, and I hoped I wouldn't meet too many snakes. The creek was narrower there than it was in our clearing, about 1.5 meters wide and as much as 60 centimetres deep. The bottom was all stones, but smooth and old ones, not too many with cutting edges, and anyway, my feet were getting tough these days. There were quite a few dark, still pools that looked very deep, so I avoided them. The creek just chattered on, minding its own business, not disturbed by my creeping progress. It had been flowing here for a long time. I followed it for about 100 metres, through many twists and turns. The beginning of the journey had been sweet, like most new journeys, I suppose, and there was a hope that the ending might be sweet also. But the middle part was getting tedious. My back was aching. I'd been scratched quite sharply on the arms. I was starting to feel hot again. But the canopy of undergrowth seemed to be getting higher and lighter. Here and there glints of sunlight bounced off the water, and the secret coolness of the tunnel was giving way to a more ordinary dry heat that we'd had back in the clearing. I straightened up a little. There was a place well ahead where the creek seemed to widen for 10 metres before it turned to the right and disappeared into undergrowth again. It spread out into a wider channel. Because the banks were no longer vertical there, they angled gently back, and I could see black soil, red rocks, and patches of moss in a little shadowy space not much bigger than our sitting room at home. I kept wading towards it, still bent-backed. There were little blue wildflowers scattered along the bank. As I got closer, I could see a mass of pink wildflowers deeper in the bush, back from the creek. I looked again and realised that they were roses. My heart suddenly beat wildly. Roses! Here, in the middle of hell? Impossible! I splashed along the last few metres to the point where the banks began to open out, and splashed out of the creek onto the mossy rock. Peering into the wild of the vegetation, I struggled to distinguish between the shadows and the solid. The only certainty was the rose bush, its flowers catching enough sunlight through the brambles to glow like pieces of soft jewellery. But gradually, I started to make sense of what I was seeing. Across there was a long horizontal of rotting black wood, here a pole serving as an upright, that dark space a doorway. I was looking at the overgrown shell of a hut. I went forward slowly, on tiptoe. It was a quiet place, and I had some sort of reverential feeling, like I did in my Stratton grandmother's drawing room, with its heavy old furniture and curtains always closed. The two places couldn't have been more different, the derelict bush hut and the solemn old sandstone house, but they both seemed a long way removed from living, from life. My grandmother wouldn't have liked being compared to a murderer, but she and the man who lived here had both been withdrawn from the world, had created islands for themselves. It was as though they'd gone beyond the grave, even while they were still on earth. At the doorway of the hut I had to pull away a lot of creeper and some tall berry canes. I wasn't too sure if I wanted to go in there. It was a bit like entering a grave. What if the hermit was still there? What if his body was lying on the floor? Or his spirit waiting to feed on the first living human to come through the door? There was a brooding atmosphere about the hut, about the whole place, that was not peaceful or pleasant. Only the roses seemed to bring any warmth into the clearing. But my curiosity was strong. It was unthinkable that I could come this far and not go further. I stepped into the darker interior and looked around, trying to define the black shapes I could see. Just as a few minutes earlier I'd had to define the shape of the hut itself from its wild surroundings. There was a bed, a table, a chair. Gradually the smaller, less obvious objects became clearer too. There was a set of shelves on a wall, a rough cupboard beside it, a fireplace with a kettle still hanging in it. In the corner was a dark shape, which gave me palpitations for a minute. It looked like a sleeping beast of some kind. I took a few steps and peered at it. It seemed to be a metal trunk, painted black originally, but now flaking with rust. Everything was like the chest, in decay. The earth floor on which I stood was covered with twigs and clods of clay from the walls. And the birds. The kettle was rusty, the bottom shelf hung askew, and the ceiling was festooned with cobwebs, but even the cobwebs looked old and dead, hanging like Miss Havisham's hair. My eyes had adjusted to the murky light by then. There was no body on the bed. I was relieved to see, but there were rotten remnants of grey blankets. The bed itself was made of lengths of timber nailed together, and still looked fairly sound. On the shelves were just a few old saucepans. I turned again to look at the chest and hit my head on a meat safe hanging from a rafter. It struck me right on the temple with its corner. "Hell!" I said, rubbing my head. It had really hurt. I knelt to look into the chest. There seemed nothing else in the hut which would offer more than had already shown me. Only the inside of the chest was still concealed. I tried to lift the lid. It was reluctant, jammed by dirt and rust, and I had to pull and shake it to get a few centimetres open. Metal ground against metal as I slowly forced it up, warping it so much that it was never going to close neatly again. My first reaction when I peered inside was disappointment. There was very little there, just a pathetic pile of tattered odds and ends at the bottom of the chest, mostly bits of paper. I pulled everything out and took them back outside into a better light. There was a belt made of plaited leather, a broken knife, a fork, and a few chess pieces, 2 pawns and a broken knight. The papers were mainly old newspapers, but sheets of writing paper too, and half of a hardbound book called Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. A large black beetle came crawling out of the book as I opened it. It fell open to a beautiful colour plate of a boat penetrating the jungle. It was actually 2 books in one. There was a second story called Youth, but the other papers were too tattered and dirty and faded to be of any interest. It seemed that the hermit's life was going to remain a mystery, even now, so many years after his disappearance. I poked around for another 10 minutes or so, inside and out, without finding much. There had been other attempts to grow flowers. As well as the roses, there was an apple tree, a sweetly scented white daisy, and a big wild patch of mint. I tried to imagine a murderer carefully planting and cultivating these beautiful plants. Tried and failed. Still, I suppose even murderers must have things they liked, and they must do something with their spare time. They couldn't just sit around all day for the rest of their lives and think about their murders. After a time, I picked up the belt and the book and waded back into the creek for the hunchback shuffle through the tunnel to our camp. It was a relief to emerge back into sunshine from that gloomy place. I'd forgotten how hot the day was out in the sunlight, but I almost welcomed its fierce glare. As soon as I appeared, Homer came striding over. "Where have you been?" he said. "We've been getting worried." He was quite angry. He sounded like my father. It seemed I'd been away for longer than I'd thought. "I've been having a close encounter with the hermit from hell," I answered. "A guided tour will leave soon. Well, as soon as I've found the ice vovos. I'm starving."
There is a conflict between Ali and Lee about their relationship, as Ali is still confused, leaving Lee feeling jealous of Homer. Ali has been exploring and has found the hermit hut, which lends evidence to the story of the hermit. Join me again in the next episode for Chapter 15 of Tomorrow When the War Began.